You're listening to episode 136 of The Secular Buddhist. Welcome to The Secular Buddhist. I'm Ted Meissner. The Secular Buddhist is the official podcast of the Secular Buddhist Association, a grassroots-driven effort to answer the needs of secular teaching and practice for contemporary society. The podcast has interviews and roundtable discussions pertaining to engaged Buddhist training and practice, and the SBA website has show notes for each episode along with resource materials. Though the podcast focuses on core practice from a secular viewpoint, more traditional teachings are welcome and openly discussed. Melissa Falb joins us to speak about her research on Buddhist coping techniques for end-of-life caregivers. We also speak about Melissa's upcoming study on meditation's effects on implicit association, particularly as it relates to our attitudes about others. As we find ourselves in this very early stage of the scientific exploration of the mind, studies which have to rely on self-reporting techniques often get a bad rap. Human beings are not always perfect in our perceptions, especially when that's a perception about us. But self-reporting can be used as a helpful indicator of what might be a promising line of inquiry. Melissa Falb is a Vipassana meditator and Ashtanga yogini, although she has dabbled in other traditions and welcomes wisdom from every source. Her primary practice of late is parenting her 8-month-old son, and in her spare time, she's a doctoral student in clinical psychology at Bowling Green State University, where she studies the intersection of spirituality and psychology. She has researched and written on a number of topics, including acceptance and commitment therapy, positive psychology, religious coping, pornography addiction, and forgiveness. Her MA thesis investigated the relationship between Buddhist coping and psychological well-being in end-of-life caregivers, and her dissertation research will be on the topic of relational interpersonal mindfulness. She is also currently working on a project comparing implicit associations towards minorities among non-novice, and experienced meditators. Please contact her if you would like to take part in this latter project, or for other reasons at mdfalb@gmail.com. So, sit back, relax, and have a nice Shark Bite Ale. And our guest today is Melissa Falb. Melissa, thanks for being here.
Thanks for having me, Ted.
Very glad to. And this whole conversation started from a posting on the Secular Buddhist Facebook fan page about a study that you will be conducting, and we'll talk about that towards the end of today's conversation. I'd like to start with having you talk about your background and what led you to studying.
Sure. We'll see if I can get there. It's kind of a roundabout story, I guess, but I've been doing yoga and meditating for about 10 years or so. And I guess I had what you would call a third life crisis, not quite a midlife crisis. Trying to decide more in terms of career what I wanted to be doing. I thought about getting my doctoral degree since my undergraduate days. I just never really had found what I loved enough to dedicate that much time to it. So, kind of skip some details here, but in any case, I thought maybe psychology was what I wanted to study, so I went back to school to take a few classes that would help me get into a program and to decide if I was interested in that. Once I started taking classes, I definitely knew that that's what I was interested in. And this was all around the same time that I had started meditating more seriously, did my first 10-day retreat. And I really saw the overlap, I guess, between what psychology is trying to do, especially clinical psychology, which is my subfield. So I'm training to be a therapist, basically, and also maybe do research, also perhaps work in an academic setting and do teaching. But as a component of that, there's a clinical piece. And I just really saw that, this, as Buddhists say, this alleviation of suffering is really what psychology is also trying to do, although it comes at it from a different approach.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm.
So my background in terms of meditation is really more in the Theravada or Vipassana tradition. I've sat a number of 10-day or longer retreats. A lot of those are with through S.M. Goenka, but I've also sat once at Spirit Rock. And then also once I was ready and accepted to a clinical psych program, I decided that, I wanted to learn a little bit more about some of the aspects of Buddhism that I hadn't been exposed to. I had spent so much time in the Theravadan tradition that I really wanted to learn more about other approaches. So I quit my job early. My husband and I both did at the beginning of the summer, late spring, before I started that fall. And we actually went and studied a little bit. We spent a month at Zen Mountain Monastery in New York, living there with the monks and nuns, just having the same day-to-day life that they do. And then we spent a month at Karma Sholing, which is a more in the Vajrayana tradition, in the lineage of Shogun Trungpa, the Shambhala, kind of the American take on Tibetan Buddhism. And then we also spent a month at a traditional Theravada monastery called Bhavana Society in West Virginia.
Yep, with Bhante G. That is my favorite place to go on retreat.
Yeah, I've sat a couple retreats there, and then we kind of same thing. We sort of lived the same life that the monks live for a month there. So that kind of like really helped me to understand Buddhism a little bit more, I guess, comprehensively or from different angles. So in any case, when I went to graduate school, I was looking for some place where I would be able to do some sort of research related to meditation or Buddhism, or mindfulness or something like that. And where I ended up is Bowling Green State University in Ohio, where they have a concentration in the psychology of religion and spirituality. They don't necessarily do a lot of work specifically with, meditation or Buddhism, but my advisor, Ken Pargament, is an expert in religious coping, and he's pretty open. He's definitely had some students do other research related to meditation or mindfulness type thing. So he was like, you can come here, you can basically research whatever you want. Like, we'll see how we can make that happen. And so that's kind of the lead up, I guess, to where I ended up. I just finished my 4th year in the graduate program. I have one more year. I'm basically mostly working on my research. I'm on a dissertation fellowship this year to try to finish up my preliminary project and put together my dissertation, which is a whole third project that you and I haven't really talked about yet. And then after that, I'll go off on clinical internship and then start my career somewhere.
Excellent. Now, one of the things that strikes me that's most interesting about this background story is that you made a very conscious choice to investigate several different traditions and several different ways of practicing meditation and seeing what the different traditions have to teach about it. What stood out for you most as you look back and compare, not just in terms of meditation teaching, but just in the approaches? What resonated most with you from all of those? What did you get out of all of them?
I mean, I guess there's two things, and one is kind of just, the commonality among all of those. I mean, there's obviously a lot of differences, and even within each of those traditions, there's actually a lot of differences. I mean, you can't talk about Zen and think like, this is it. It depends on who you're studying with or what country the Zen came from or how it's been integrated into Western society, so there's that complexity. But on the other hand, they're all still really trying to get, to this stillness, to this understanding of the human mind. And it's not as if like there's one way, it's like they're all heading in the same direction. The other thing that really stood out to me, and I know this is related to the particular places we chose to go, and it may have seemed different had we gone other places, but coming at it from a psychological approach, I really felt like if you take Freud's theory, and I don't know how many of our listeners are going to be familiar with a lot of that, he talks about the ego, the id, and the superego, and these three approaches really struck me as kind of falling into that. So the Theravadan approach is more, at least my experience of it, I know like places like Spirit Rock, it's definitely integrated more with Western psychology, I guess, but I liken it a little bit more to maybe more fundamentalist Christian traditions, that there's a lot of focus on the scripture. And so for me, that was more identified, kind of, it reminded me of the super ego, like there's like kind of rule based in a sense. versus the Shambhala tradition that we studied is very loose. And if you know anything about the history of Chogyam Trungpa, then you're very familiar with that. Like he's really just trying to integrate his teachings into like the 60s Western culture and meet people where they were, And so for me, it was much more id-based, just kind of open to like, I don't really know how to describe it, I guess, in layman's terms necessarily, but just, to this playful aspect, I guess, of human design, childlike aspect maybe or something, just very not rule driven, And then the Zen approach to me seemed to be somewhere in the middle, like the egos, like that which is kind of moving in between and integrating the superego and the id, So it kind of took into account a little bit of both. It was very relevant to like day-to-day living and like the actual challenges that we have. But I think a lot of that, had to do with the teachers that I was studying with there, and I know they're much different Zen approaches. So I don't want to generalize that across the board, but it was really interesting to me how those three styles kind of fit in with this psychological structure of the mind that Freud talked about.
Yeah, interesting. And I love that you have taken the time to do that full analysis, to find out more about what different traditions have to say, so that you're able to understand that commonality and what they share and how those can all be helpful. It's simply that some of us will resonate a little bit more with one way of engaging with that, and some folks will engage more with another.
And that's definitely a benefit of it. It's like there's something for everyone.
Yeah, absolutely. So let's talk about not the study that you're looking for people on, but one that you have written up and is not published yet. And the study is called Buddhist Coping Predicts Psychological Outcomes Among End-of-Life Caregivers. And you've written this there's a co-author on this. Could you say a little bit about that?
Sure. Ken Pargament is my advisor at Bowling Green. He's been there for about 30 years. And I guess that you may be asking me about this in a minute. Can I give you a little bit of lead up into?
Yeah, please do. Yeah.
How I got to the study. So one of Ken's areas of expertise is religious coping. And I was working with him. I was actually revising a chapter that he had written previously on religious coping. And one of the things that I noticed as I was making these revisions is that while there's been a very, very large amount of research done looking at styles or strategies of religious coping, as you might expect, given that we're a predominantly Christian culture, most of that work has been done with Christians. And in the last decade, there's also been some beginnings of work being done with Jewish coping, Muslim coping, and Hindu coping. There have been religious coping scales created for each of those traditions, but there was nothing Buddhist. And so originally I thought, well, maybe I'll put together a Buddhist coping scale for measuring the ways that Buddhists, basically handle stress. But then talking to Ken, Dr. Pargament, he knew that someone had actually recently created something. They were just developing it, actually. So rather than recreate the wheel, I thought, well, I'm going to take the work that Russell Phillips, he's the primary author on the Buddhist coping scale, which actually was just published several months ago. I wanted to take his work and expand that. So that was kind of the starting point for the study. Originally, I had thought maybe I would work with hospice patients. I was really intrigued by the way that Buddhism approaches death. But working with hospice patients can be particularly challenging just because, they may not be up for doing the research just because of, struggles that they're having physically and emotionally, I suppose. So the next best thing that I could think of was, well, let me work with the caregivers who are working with those patients. So that was kind of where it came from.
Okay, so tell us about the study itself. What form did that take? Because I know we had some questions on the Facebook page about the one that you're planning on doing. Let's talk about what you formulated for this as your method.
Sure. Well, it was an online study. Online studies allowed me to access caregivers, actually not just around the country, but from around the world, although most of the participants were US-based participants. It was what we call a self-report study. So the participants aren't really doing anything other than answering questions. So there were a number of things that I was looking at. There were three main places where I asked them questions. One was what we call demographics, so it's just their background information. How old are they? How long have they been caregiving? What role do they take in caregiving? What kind of patients do they work with? What style of Buddhism do they practice? How long have they been practicing? How long have they been meditating? How often do they meditate? How religious are they? How spiritual are they? All those kinds of questions were the demographic questions. I also asked them some questions with what we call our predictor variable, which is the Buddhist coping scale, which I'll probably refer to as the B-cope.
Mm-hmm.
I say that so you know what that means. And that was 66 questions, I believe, about different styles or ways that Buddhists cope with stress. And this was what Russ Phillips put together. And it encompassed like 14 different categories. So some of those categories would be, mindfulness, meditation, interbeing, so questions about this idea that we're all connected, Sangha support, so how do they utilize their Buddhist community to help them cope. There were some more negative kinds of coping, so things like bad Buddhists, that like I'm not a good enough Buddhist. Passive karma, which is kind of like I couldn't do anything about it because it was, due to my past actions or due to my karma.
Yeah.
Those kinds of things. And then the third questions that the respondents answered for me were what we call the outcome variables. So these were the psychological outcomes that I was trying to see if they were related to the different Buddhist strategies for coping. So I had four areas that I asked them questions about there. One was depression, so kind of trying to look at any depressive symptoms that they had. Another was burnout, which I didn't talk to you a whole lot about, I guess, some of the background in terms of religious coping specific to caregivers and end-of-life caregivers, but there's a lot of research showing that caregiving is very stressful. End-of-life caregivers especially have a lot of stresses, and they do tend to experience a lot of negative things, anxiety or guilt or just a lot of stress. So in any case, I was looking at burnout to see how that might be related to different ways of coping. And then I was looking at two more positive outcomes. One was spiritual well-being, and the other one was post-traumatic growth. So ways in which the stress could help them lead to growth.
So looking at the results that you got from, it looks like you had an online survey of 92 end-of-life caregivers. You do a great job of showing what the demographics of them were and the frequency of the different coping methods that they use. What did you find as the results? What stood out to you when you looked at the return that you got?
I mean, the first thing to say is that, in a sense, the results aren't really that surprising. So there's a vast amount of research, like I said, mostly with looking at Christian populations, that show if you use more what we call positive styles of coping, so these are things that maybe help you make meaning out of your situations, help you move towards actualization, those kinds of things. If you use those styles of coping, you're going to have positive outcomes. And if you use more negative styles of coping, so traditionally this is maybe passivity or having some kind of spiritual struggle, feeling you're being punished or abandoned or something like that, it's going to have negative results. So that's in a nutshell. I mean, that's kind of what I found with my study, is that these more positive styles of Buddhist coping were related to positive outcomes, and the more negative styles of Buddhist coping were related to negative outcomes. Trying to think if I can look at my results here and give you some specific examples. So, for example, there were two parts of the study actually. I mean, let me just say that real quick. So first, I kind of looked at all the different styles of coping to see how they were related to my outcome variables, so the depression, burnout, those kinds of things. But that gave me a whole lot of data, and it was pretty unwieldy. So then what I tried to do was say, can I distill this down and actually say positive Buddhist coping altogether and negative Buddhist coping altogether? So kind of combine them into these two distinct styles. And when I did something statistically called a factor analysis, it basically showed that, yes, that works. Like this two-factor approach is the best way to kind of summarize these results. So that's a little bit more concise. So when you look at those results, what I found was, so these positive styles of coping altogether were associated with several positive things. So increased sense of personal accomplishment in one's work as a caregiver, increased sense of meaning and peace. So this is a spiritual well-being, increased sense of faith. And then it was also related to lower levels of one negative outcome, which is depersonalization. That's one of the burnout scales. So basically, depersonalization is when caregivers start to maybe look at the people that they're caring for, not seeing them as fully human, maybe just kind of viewing them as, an aspect of their work rather than a full human being or something like that. And then on the negative side, the negative Buddhist coping styles were associated with a decreased level of meaning and peace in one's life and increased symptoms of depression. So that's kind of the short summary.
So out of that, and looking at these results, so you have the positive B cope and the negative B cope, and these patterns arise when you look at just a wide variety of data. When you group it a certain way, then it really clarifies, yes, this is what we're seeing. And bear in mind, for folks who are listening to this, who say, well, it's self-reporting, and so of course there is some question of the validity of, is this accurate data? Because self-reporting is often not understood. However, we do have a group that all did take the same study. And so what we would expect to see some specific kinds of reflections of positive and negative coping mechanisms and those results. And that is what we saw. And this was, bear in mind, one of the first in-depth looks amongst a self-identified Buddhist population. So of course, there's more work to be done. I think one of the things we can take away from this is that it's a good indicator that this is an area where we can do more research and find it, because we are seeing patterns here. Melissa, what do you think about that? Is that a fair assessment that, yes, this indicates we can do more research?
Definitely. I mean, there are a lot of areas, a lot of different ways to take this. And I think one thing that's maybe important to note as well, on the issue of this is self-report data, respondents were answering a whole range of questions. And one thing that stood out to me was that the Buddhist participants we were looking at actually used a lot more of the positive styles of Buddhist coping or Buddhist coping strategies, and not very many of the negative Buddhist coping strategies. But of those few people who were reporting that they were having these thoughts about, like, I'm not meditating enough, or this is too hard, or, I'm being punished by karma or whatever, those individuals, still did have these negative outcomes that we were talking about. So we're looking at like a full range of data from, positive coping to negative coping. In terms of future research, I think there's definitely a lot of places this can go. This is the first, hopefully published. It's under review right now, and the process takes a long time because there's really the first in-depth look using the Buddhist coping scale with a self-identified population. And I think it would be interesting to look at, maybe hospice patients themselves, although that'll be a more challenging population to get. It could be interesting to look at Western Buddhists in comparison to Eastern Buddhists, people who have chosen Buddhism as an alternative to the mainstream cultural religion, as opposed to being brought up naturally in the religion, and maybe people who are more secular Buddhists, if you will, people who aren't necessarily as interested in some of the doctrinal or dogmatic aspects, but they're really more interested in these benefits, like how can it help me alleviate suffering, how can it help me deal with challenges of living, like pain, old age, death, those kinds of things. So there could be some interesting differences based on Western versus Eastern, or rather someone is simply born Buddhist, or I guess converted, if you want to call it that.
Well, it's interesting to note that you yourself have looked at the Pew study on the large segment in the United States, at least, of Buddhism, that it is one of the largest growing designations. And one of the things that came out recently is that Pew study that both you and I have quoted and used in our work. One of the things that they have stepped up and said that they did not do well with that is the analysis of the country of origin background. And so they vastly underrepresented, and they're very upfront about here was a failing and what we need to do better on. So kudos to them on that. is they missed a large segment of the Asian population simply because their questionnaire was in English, and many of the people that were their respondents couldn't respond because that was not a language that they used. So this is an area where they are taking steps to improve their methodology. So for folks listening, I think that's one of the important lessons for us is we learn from where we may have some gaps and we make it better. Science isn't about final conclusions that can never be questioned. That's not at all what science is. Science is about provisional acceptance based on our current understanding and the evidence that we can demonstrate.
Yeah, exactly.
So, good luck with the publishing process of this. I'm eager to see it in print, and thank you for talking with us about that. What I'd like to do now is move on to a conversation about what you're working on next. And I know that there are some constraints that you have around what you can share on that so as not to skew the data from any potential listeners. But please do tell us about what you're working on now.
Well, so the study that I'm working on that I had posted on Secular Buddhist Facebook page about is actually just, it's not part of my degree, it's actually just something I've been really interested in for some time. So speaking of Freud, this idea of the conscious versus sort of the subconscious, there's something called the implicit association test. And what this looks at is implicit association. So implicit being things that are below the level of awareness rather than explicit, like things that we can identify about ourselves. So the implicit association test, or the IAT, is something that there have been many hundreds of studies published looking at this, and it's basically, it's a little complicated to explain, but it shows that we carry beliefs, and this wouldn't surprise anyone who has sat for a long time and looked at their own mind, but we carry beliefs that maybe we're not aware of, and so we might say, well, I'm not racist, but then notice that when someone of a different race gets in an elevator with us, we have a reaction, or that kind of thing. And so the IAT is an online computer-based test. So this isn't a self-report kind of thing where you tell me, yes, I have a more positive attitude towards men than towards women, for example. Although we ask those questions as well, but it's based on reaction times. So let me see if I can explain this easily. So basically what happens, as one example, there would be like a black-white, or African-American, Caucasian IAT. And what would happen is you'd be shown white faces and you would be shown black faces. And you would be shown positive words, so like, I'm trying to remember the exact words that they use, but like, joy, happiness, I don't know, those kinds of things. Negative words, like, I don't remember, bad, I don't know, just negative kinds of words. And then at one point, and I apologize, it's a little bit difficult to explain, I hope this makes sense. So first you would be shown either, African American faces and positive words. And whenever you see those two things, you have to hit a key on the left side of your keyboard. And whenever you see a white face or a negative word, you have to hit a key on the right side of your keyboard. And so the idea is it's measuring reaction times. How easily can you pair positive words with black faces versus white faces? And then based on the quickness of those responses, it determines whether or not you have a bias. So the idea is that, and a lot of this can be actually associated with culture. So if you constantly view television programs or movies that show blacks as being criminals or something, you may naturally have these negative associations. And so it may be harder for you to pair black faces with positive words, but it would be easier to pair white faces with positive words. Does that make sense?
That does make sense. And what I like about the idea of the study is it's not making a judgment call about one's reactions. It's acknowledging that these are often, one explanation is biological. This is part of what our makeup is. And really what we're trying to find out is what is the general tone of our population? How are we responding as a culture? What does the science reveal about that? And that in itself then indicates And if that's not something we like, how can we get better?
Right, and there's definitely some arguments that the IAT is measuring not just something, or maybe even primarily, I don't know, something about the individual, but also something that's related to the social upbringing. And so the study that I'm doing is, the idea is that, if as meditators we're starting to break down some of those habitual responses, I guess, that there might be some differences between performance on the IAT of non-meditators versus meditators. And what I'm trying to get, we have already plenty of non-meditators. Those are easy to get.
Yeah.
I'm trying to get more meditators, either people who even have a little bit of experience or experienced meditators who've been meditating for 20 or 30 years. And we can, do some statistical analyses looking at the length of time meditating to see if that does have an impact. But basically, I'm using some implicit association tests looking at race, and then also another one looking at sexual orientation. And just trying to see, are there any differences does meditation have an effect on these kinds of implicit processes? That's sort of the overarching goal.
I would imagine that there would be some interesting analysis to be done with the people who take the test, whether they are in a diverse culture, whether they are black or white. So if you take someone from a very ethnically non-diverse background and have them take this test versus a very ethnically diverse background and have them take this test, and that's probably going to be future studies and refinement of what you're doing, but I would be very interested to see how those differences may show, and particularly with regards to not just racial diversity, but as you're saying, gender identification diversity, and how those attitudes are impacted.
Yeah, and there's definitely some self-report questions. The entire survey with the implicit association test probably takes 20 to 30 minutes, just depending on how quickly people answer the questions and stuff. But there's definitely some self-report questions, trying to find out, how often people meditate or engage in other spiritual practices. Actually, we ask about some other spiritual practices, but then also their own race and their experience with individuals of different ethnic backgrounds and different sexual orientations, so that we can, link those two things, not the IAT with some of the self-report data that the individuals provide.
Excellent, excellent. Well, people who are listening, if you're interested in participating in this study or finding out more about it, you can email Melissa at mdfalb, that's mdfalb at gmail.com. Melissa Falb has been our guest today. Melissa, thank you very much for your time today, and I'm really eager to hear the results of this upcoming study.
Great, my pleasure. Thanks a lot, Ted.
Thanks for listening. If you'd like to learn more about something you've heard in today's podcast, please come visit the SBA website at secularbuddhism.org, and you'll find an entire webpage devoted to this and every episode. Discussion about this episode can be found on the episode page itself, along with show notes. The music for The Secular Buddhist is used by permission from John Kaizen Neptune's CD, Steps in Time. Additional music is provided courtesy of Monty Levinson of Taihei Shakuhachi and Rodrigo Rodriguez. Their websites are also linked on the SBA site on the About Podcast Music page. Until next time, remember, every moment you have a choice. Make it the best you can. See you next time on The Secular Buddhist.